Has anyone heard about what's happening behind the scenes with Vince McMahon? It's truly devastating. The man who once had absolute control over the wrestling world is now completely silent, which is leading to serious questions. Reports are surfacing, whispers are getting louder, and even his wife Linda has spoken out with. Long before he became one of the most divisive figures in entertainment, Vince McMahon had a shocking tone that caught everyone off guard. This wasn't a plot point. It wasn't a part of the show. Something had changed, and it wasn't good. What happened to him? Stay with us because what's about to happen might leave you speechless. Vince McMahon's humble beginnings were marred by a lack of stability and order in his life. He didn't meet his biological father until he was 12 years old, but that changed everything. Vince's father, Vince Sr., ran the modest, old-school Capital Wrestling Corporation, a wrestling promotion in the Northeast. Vince Jr. saw something new happen when Vince McMahon bought out his father's business in the early 1980s. He took a huge risk by planning to go national, which was unprecedented at the time. Promoter back then stuck to their regions and respected their employers. What followed was a hostile takeover of the company and the entire industry. Vince ripped up the map, recruited wrestlers from other territories, put money into cable TV, and, most importantly, threw himself wholeheartedly into creating WrestleMania. The 1985 inaugural event nearly bankrupted him because he had staked all of his financial resources on it. Thankfully, WrestleMania didn't bomb, it exploded. From that point on, Vince McMahon became a larger-than-life figure. He went from being the CEO behind the scenes to stepping into the ring, playing the villain, getting physical, and becoming a character that the audience loved to hate. He was haughty. Not to mention Hulk Hogan, Mr. T, Cyndi Lauper, and Muhammad Ali brought wrestling mainstream attention like never before. The 90s were a time of wild ratings wars, blood feuds, and insane stunts, but Vince kept the machine running smoothly, even when it looked like chaos. For example, when Stone Cold Steve Austin flipped him off and delivered a stunner, it became the visual that defined the Attitude Era. Many people don't realize how much of the company ran through him personally. He wasn't just an executive. He was in the trenches rewriting the rules and building WWF into a billion-dollar empire. His 2001 purchase of WCW was the final confirmation that he had won and become the undisputed king of professional wrestling. Vince maintained a firm grasp on wrestling, molding not just the industry's financial aspects, but also its cultural tone. His fingerprints were evident in everything from match pacing and interview delivery to the structure of rivalries. For decades, it appeared as though nothing could slow Vince down, but every so often, someone would hint at the fact that Vince never revealed no indications of slowing down, but perhaps he ought to have undergone surgery. Injuries, scandals, controversies, and the world around him all swirled around him, but Vince remained unfazed. What's even more astounding is that, despite his decades of power, he remained shrouded in mystery. Fans saw the character, employees saw the boss, but few ever laid eyes on the man. Now in light of recent reports that have raised serious concerns about his condition, many are reflecting on Vince McMahon's rise to power and questioning whether we truly understood his story, or were we merely observers of the illusion he created. Vince appeared invincible to the outside world, but his life was actually a complex web of rituals, paranoia, and extremes. His former employees and rumor has it that Vince's daily schedule was nothing short of hellish. Wake up at the crack of dawn, train like a bodybuilder, fly across the country, micromanage live shows, rewrite scripts until the wee hours of the morning, and then do it all over again. Vince wasn't just the head of WWE. He was WWE. From the line of commentary to the outcome of matches, every on-air joke or insult was Vince's creation. His stories became legendary for their symbolic intensity. He despised sneezing, particularly his own, because it made him feel helpless. He expected others to ignore their fatigue as well. If a writer dozed off on a red-eye flight, they would often find Vince sitting wide-eyed across from them, still working. He even ate. He ate an absurd amount of steak, hated chicken salad, and flat-out refused to believe in illness. The joke around the office was that Vince thought he could outwork death. However, as the years passed, the facade of his powerful walk and tailored suits began to crumble. Rumors began to circulate about surgeries, and there was talk of mounting injuries from decades of physical stunts he did on screen. Although the character was cartoonish, the man behind it all had endured brutal assaults, including chair smashes and real punches. Despite this, Vince never let his injuries show. For example, when he tore both quadriceps in 2005 after sprinting into the ring at the Royal Rumble, he famously sat in the ring and gave orders while unable to move. But writers and producers who had been there for years noticed how he started to rely more on others. He would disappear from some meetings, sometimes pause and seem forgetful mid-con conversation, and he would refuse to show pain. Most fans never knew because of this, but he wasn't the only one. Vince, who was already in his 70s by the 2010s, continued to work at the same rapid pace as in the 80s, despite the fact that the wrestling industry had changed. Social media had altered fan interactions, and his audience had grown younger. However, his instincts remained firmly entrenched in the past. As time went on, the empire started to decentralize, at least on the surface. However, despite all the talk about a changing of the guard, Vince's shadow remained over everything, even after stepping down in 2022. Some admired his consistency, while others saw him as out of step. More talent started speaking up, including Stephanie and others within the family. Investigation. Few thought it would be permanent, and they were correct. Soon after, he reappeared, seamlessly reintegrating himself into the system. There was no farewell tour or speech, just a neatly trimmed mustache and a subtle hint of defiance, as if to declare, "I'm still here." But something was off, even through excessively controlled public appearances caught people's attention. They noticed that he moved slower, his face looked sunken, and his posture had changed. Fans started to wonder what the price had been for decades of unrelenting ambition. The truth remained hidden, but for the time being. Vince McMahon's silence became louder than any promotional video he had ever made. It was as if he was stepping back, not just stepping away, from the spotlight, which was a change for him. It was the first time in a long time that his invincibility as a character started to crumble. What lay beneath was a man older, worn, and maybe even vulnerable. The man who had been at the center of every scandal, milestone, and spectacle had begun to fade away, slowly but surely. Those paying attention started to question why this change had occurred, and the most noticeable change occurred in 2022, when news of alleged hush money payments related to misconduct broke. Claims headlines exploded when, at the age of 77, Vince announced his resignation. His statement was clinical and businesslike, leading many to believe it was the end of an era. However, few months later, he was re-elected to the board, influencing corporate strategy and even resurfacing as a figure behind the scenes. His return felt like classic, unapologetic Vince. Stratagem. Fans were divided, but most agreed it was a power move only he could pull off. However, something seemed off about this tour. He wasn't performing live, he wasn't yelling directions from behind the scenes, and when he did make an appearance, it wasn't the Vince that fans remembered. His once imposing swagger had vanished, and he appeared noticeably thinner. An elderly man attempting to keep command of an empire that had long since outgrown any one individual. The change wasn't merely physical, it was also tonal. Even in public speeches, there was reluctance, pauses, and a lack of the passion that had once characterized him. Then came reports, first whispers from those close to the company, that he had undergone extensive spinal surgery, and the recovery had taken longer than expected. As expected, a hip replacement was also part of the plan. These weren't your average minor procedures. They were life-altering surgeries, especially for someone who is approaching 80 years old. One report indicated that the spinal operation had taken several hours and left him temporarily unable to walk without assistance. Neither Vince nor WWE confirmed any of this, but their silence spoke volumes. His appearance at the 2025 Super Bowl was one of the few times the public could catch a glimpse of him. However, viewers quickly noticed that he appeared frail, walked stiffly, and was accompanied by a cane. The video went viral for all the wrong reasons, and fans who had grown up watching him as the extravagant Mr. McMahon couldn't believe what they were seeing. Witnessing it wasn't a matter of aging. Rather, it felt like a sudden collapse. Despite attempts by insiders to minimize the situation, such as saying he's recovering or that he's still sharp, the contrast was too great to ignore. This wasn't the Attitude Era Vince McMahon yelling commands in the ring or the businessman securing billion-dollar TV deals. Rather, it was a man obviously fighting. Vince's iron grip was loosening, but it wasn't because he wanted it to. Rumors started circulating that different executives were handling contracts, marketing, and production, and that Triple H had fully taken over creative direction. Even those closest to him started managing expectations. His official messaging remained vague, with no statement, interview, or explanation. Fans were left with more questions than answers, wondering if he was okay, if this was his final separation, or if this was just another quiet chapter in an unending story. What was once unthinkable was now hard to deny. Vince McMahon, who once boasted about his genetic superiority, now appears frail, and this isn't even a plot point. Word got out a few days ago that McMahon was back in the hospital, but this time the focus wasn't on legal issues, falling ratings, or drama behind the scenes. Rather, it was on issues involving close friends and family. What makes this so hard to process is that he was described as an unrecognizable, fragile, quiet, and drastically different man than the larger-than-life figure who used to strut into arenas to the roar of thousands. There was no grand entrance, no defiant grin, no Mr. McMahon character. Instead, he was a man in recovery, surrounded by silence. Is the abruptness with which it occurs, despite the long list of red flags. Vince, for years, gave the impression that he could overcome any obstacle, be it old age, an injury, or a scandal. After all, he was the one who tore his quads on live television and continued to give instructions from the mat as if nothing had happened. Vince also boasted about working 20 hours a day and getting only a few hours of sleep each night. You can't deny the impact Vince McMahon had. He built an empire from what seemed like an impossible place. So when news broke that he was back in a hospital bed, struggling to move, looking weak and confused, people weren't just shocked. They felt something else entirely: heartbreak. Vince McMahon was a game-changer in the world of professional wrestling. He catapulted the careers of famous wrestlers like Stone Cold Steve Austin, John Cena, and countless more. His influence extended far beyond the confines of wrestling, and fans still ask, "Have you heard about what happened to Vince?" For McMahon, it's not just about his health. It's about the myth that some people are untouchable, that tenacity and resolve can stave off the passage of time, and that someone like Vince would never quietly fade away. Those closest to him haven't spoken about it, and it's shocking. According to those who have seen him, he looks completely different from the man they worked with a few years ago. He used to bark out orders from the gorilla position, but now he needs help standing up. One former employee described it as, "It's like seeing a statue crack." There is no public video, statement, or denial regarding this. WWE fans are used to shocking twists, but this one hurts, maybe because it's so unexpected, especially since no one has said how long he was in the hospital or what his current condition is. Vince has always been careful about controlling narratives, so if this leaked, it likely couldn't be hidden any longer. Vince McMahon's story feels incomplete, as if this is the final chapter or simply a pause. There is no comeback promo, no steel chair save, and no retirement speech in the center of the ring. Instead, what we see is a man who has given his all to the business, and now appears as though he may have nothing left to give. Yes, have you heard about what happened to Vince McMahon? It's genuinely tragic. The world is left speechless. The reaction was immediate, and it wasn't limited to fans. This is the first time he has shocked the world in an unexpected way, but this time the silence is the headline. For a man who seeks spectacle, the quiet is the most unsettling. "Something is deeply wrong," Linda McMahon said, shocking everyone as they tried to put the pieces together of the public speculation and unusual sightings to put Vince McMahon's decades-long silence into context. Linda had stood by her husband through his rise to fame, scandals, and lawsuits, but her words now seemed different. "He's not the man he used to be, not physically, not emotionally." The words, which were unfiltered and devoid of any corporate gloss, spread quickly. She refrained from speaking through WWE channels or press releases, but their subtle indirection had a powerful impact. Despite her decades-long composure, the co-founder of the company now sounded devastated. At that moment, the world of wrestling seemed much smaller. Wrestlers from the past and present started speaking out, with some offering respectful remarks and others expressing their shock. One longtime WWE producer wrote, "I never." The internet was awash with tribute videos, TikToks, and Instagram reels of Vince in his glory days, when he would leap into the ring, spray beer, and growl into a microphone. But now there was a subdued sadness in the air, and there was the stark contrast with WWE. Even though some saw it as cruel, others saw it as precisely what Vince would have wanted: no pity, no attention, just business. The machine he built kept running like clockwork, airing weekly shows, moving forward with scripts, and keeping the lights on. However, for those who had experienced a profound change, the feeling that something had changed was palpable. They had been working with Vince for a while, and they had noticed some changes: a slower walk, a quieter voice, and a reluctance to stand for too long during meetings. But no one had anticipated it would get this bad. Linda, in particular, was blamed by those close to her for trying to retire him years ago out of concern for his health and his incapacity to slow down, but Vince, as usual, refused. Now she stood by, helpless to reverse his decline. Rumor has it that she was devastated. The emotional breakdown of a partnership that had persevered through thick and thin, a partnership in which Linda had always maintained her composure, added a new layer of gravity to the situation. Her role behind the scenes was multifaceted. She had served as CEO, a Senate candidate, and a soothing influence while Vince stormed through life. Now that she was raising her voice, and the world was finally paying attention, questions naturally ensued. Was she speaking out because no one else would? Or was this her way of ensuring that the truth was known before it was hidden behind corporate propaganda? The usual programming from WWE continued unabated. No statement, confirmation, or denial. However, Linda's words resounded more strongly in the silence. It was no longer about a single man. It became about what happens when even the strongest start to fade, and those closest to them are helpless to stop it. This is the last bell in the world, and everyone is waiting for Vince to return, for WWE to finally say something, and for Linda, the woman who has stayed silent throughout, to say something. This time, her voice doesn't sound like show business. It sounds like grief. As questions arise and silence replaces McMahon's voice, fans are left to wonder what happens when the showrunner disappears without an official announcement. His rule and religion were that the show must go on regardless of injuries, scandals, departures, or deaths. There has been no official announcement regarding Vince McMahon's health, but the image of him in the hospital, thin and frail, and next to it, Linda's whispered words reveal what few dared to say aloud, that the man who once ruled WWE might no longer have control over anything. Even though the empire he built is still going strong, the Emperor has fallen silent, and there's a peculiar beauty in that, because for all the chaos that has ensued, this ending isn't the one anyone was hoping for. Instead of a public appearance, a symbolic farewell, or a passing of the torch in the ring, we're left with shadows, rumors, and sadness. All the noise that Vince McMahon made during his lifetime, the roar of the crowds, the pyrotechnics, the music, the mayhem, this moment cuts through the ego, the gimmicks, and gets to the heart of the matter. A man who gave his all to create a world that millions fell in love with, and now that world continues to spin without him. Some think he'll. Rumors that Vince McMahon can't seem to let go, suggesting that he might return to the office, yell orders, or even appear on a screen. However, there's also a mounting suspicion that we may have already witnessed the last chapter. If this is the case, it happened suddenly, with no theme music or dramatic twist, just a mysterious disappearance that nobody anticipated. So what's left to discover? There are so many mixed emotions swirling around Vince McMahon right now: mystery, awe, frustration, admiration, and sadness, because he was more than just a man. He was a myth, and now that myth is crumbling, exposing the price of being too big. Who knows what's going on behind those walls? But one thing is certain: the silence says more than any promotional hype ever could. The question now isn't what Vince will do next, for the first time in decades, but rather, what will we remember? What do you think? Tell us in the comments.